while, and I will come back to join us as soon as possible. And I believe that under the able facilitation of Tara, we will have a very fruitful discussion. I will leave to Tara. Thanks.
Thank you, Gao, very much. Good luck with your other chairing role, and we will look forward to you coming back, by which time I hope we'll be firmly embedded in a discussion and interactive question and answer session. So thank you, and we understand. Yes, you can't be two places at once. So before we dive into proceedings for the second meeting, I'm going to share a few reflections on the first meetings of the PR2 SED, and the lessons that we've learned, and how those lessons have informed our planning for this meeting. I also just wanted to point out to the parties in the room, as you came into the room, there weren't any nameplates for you to pick up. They are available now over in this corner of the room. So if you want to have one of those at hand later for asking a question, they're just here in the corner of the room if you want to pick one up now or at a later stage. Thank you. So just going back then to some of the lessons that we've learned and how we've built those into the design then of this session of the Structured Expert Dialogue. So as you know, COVID containment measures forced us to hold the first meeting of the PR2 SED entirely virtually over 2 sessions in November 2020 and June 2021. And thank you, all of you who took part in those sessions. There was great attendance and almost more questions than we could manage. Overcoming the many practical challenges, we considered the 3 Ipcc special reports published in 2018 and 2019, information from parties, contributions from other UN agencies and international organizations. The extensive and rich discussions we had contributed to deepening our understanding of the long-term global goal and of overall progress towards achieving it. As noted in the summary report of the first meeting, our informal discussions in June this year, a number of substantive and procedural issues were raised that we as co-facilitators should consider as we planned for this, the second, and then the third meetings of the PR2 SED, the Periodic Review 2 Structured Expert Dialogue. Lots of acronyms for those of you not part of the process or new to it. Procedurally, parties highlighted the need for significant time for discussions and welcomed the opportunities provided by the poster session to go deeper into some of the issues presented. In response, we have devoted 2 hours out of the 3-hour slot today for moderated discussions, with invited speakers providing brief interventions, and that will be the same model that we use tomorrow. I trust that all our experts will support us and keep their interventions focused and succinct, because we do want to have time for them to take the floor again when addressing all of your questions. Further, we continued to invite poster contributions to complement our discussions at plenary. To further facilitate the dialogue between parties and experts, we made contributions from the speakers and posters available online prior to the meeting. And you can find all of the presentations that you will see today on the SED website. In terms of substance, many of you called for presentations to focus more directly on the themes of the second periodic review outlined in Decision 5CP25, paragraph 4. In addition, as outlined in the summary report, we plan to consider information from regional and sub-regional agencies and the working group contributions to the Ipcc AR6 as they become available. In response, we have structured the 2 parts of the second meeting, today and tomorrow, around global and regional aspects, with part 1 today focusing on global aspects and part 2 tomorrow afternoon on regional perspectives related to the 2 themes of the second periodic review. We have provided specific guidance to the speakers and poster contributors to directly address the guiding questions under the 2 themes of the second periodic review. So, for today's session, we will focus on the global aspects with the Ipcc Working Group 1 contribution to the 6th Assessment Report published in August this year, the UNEP Emissions Gap Report published last week, as well as input from the Standing Committee on Finance on the 4th Biennial Assessment and the overview of climate finance flows as primary inputs. We fully appreciate the rich information contained in the Ipcc AR6 Working Group 1 volume. We are not pretending that we can cover all of that material here this afternoon, but in case you are interested, we'd wanted to let you know that there will be an IPCC SBSTA special event called Unpacking the New Scientific Knowledge and Key Findings in Working Group 1 Contribution to the IPCC 6th Assessment Report, the Physical Science Basis, and that event will take place from 10:30 to 1:30 on Thursday, the 4th of November. That's this Thursday. We hope this will be a great opportunity for parties to engage with the IPCC report in much greater depth than we will get into today. What we will focus on today is the new information in the Working Group 1 report that responds directly to the 2 themes of the second periodic review. Tomorrow then we'll hear regional perspectives, that will be our focus, and I'm pleased to report that we have a rich collection of posters illustrating how global trends and associated impacts have been manifesting at the regional level. So you can use the COP platform to access the poster sessions. So now, for today's proceedings, a few logistical notes. As we're holding this meeting here in Glasgow, we are some of us here in person, but we also have a virtual component. I would like to point out that for those registered with access to the COP platform, you will be able to interact with the experts by raising questions through the chat function. And with the help of the Secretariat, we will try to respond to your questions to the extent possible. To make efficient use of our time, we will only take questions after the experts have spoken. So please make note of your questions and to which expert you will direct your question to. We'll open the floor for discussions and questions of clarification on the specific presentations, and then we'll keep adequate time at the end also for general discussion. We're going to have a slight change to the order we were going to hear from our speakers in, just because people are needed in other sessions as well. And so I would like to invite the Standing On Committee on Finance and Vicky to take the floor first. She's going to give us her presentation first, followed by questions of clarification to her before she has to leave at 4 o'clock. And then we'll follow up with presentation from the IPCC and then from the UN Environment Programme as well. So Vicky, please, we are looking forward to hearing from you about the work of the Standing Committee on Finance. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much, moderator, and also good afternoon to everybody. So delegates and ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to present today's findings of the SCF Biennial Assessment. Thank you. So just making sure that the slides will be on the screen. So on behalf of my co-facilitator, as I said, it's a great pleasure to be here and to present you the outcomes of the 4th Biennial Assessment. It will be a quite brief presentation, as was asked. Also, as said by Tara, I have to leave at 4 o'clock because Gao gave us homework on transparency, so he's the one you should blame. But we've made sure that if I'm not able to respond to your questions, a colleague from the Secretariat will stay in the room and respond to your questions if necessary. So to the substance itself. So the 4th Biennial Assessment, as you may know, it's actually 2 different products. We have on the one hand the summary, and on the other hand the underlying technical report. Both of those are available on the UNFCCC website, and the summary is also contained in the annex of the annual report of the SCF to COP26. The underlying technical report, of course, has the wealth of information, which I will only now be able to give you a short update of what's in there. It has 4 substantive chapters. Chapter 1 considers the methodological issues related to transparency of climate finance. Chapter 2 provides an overview of current climate finance flows from the years 2017-2018, including information on identified trends from previous years. And Chapter 3 assesses these climate finance flows, considering the implications of their purpose, composition, effectiveness, access, and emergent trends relevant in the context of the UNFCCC. Also, for the first time, the 4th Biennial Assessment has a 4th chapter, which is in response to the mandate from COP24, and it's about mapping information relevant to Article 21C, including its reference to Article 9 thereof. So this is what is contained in the Biennial Assessment. Perhaps also important to know what is not in there. The Biennial Assessment doesn't explicitly assess progress towards the 100 billion goal, but because it has a much broader scope. But relevant information on the issue can be found in the report. Now, the approach to the 4th Biennial Assessment has been the same as in previous ones, but a bit more digital this time, I would say. So we have had extensive stakeholder engagement and input, which then the various inputs received from parties and non-party stakeholders are all available on the website, along with a series of webinars held during the preparation of the report. So if we then go to the key outcomes of the fourth biennial assessment, I think most of us might be already familiar with the onion diagram, which actually gives an overview of climate finance flows in the period 2017-2018. This is actually a very helpful way of framing the different flows that form part of the global total climate finance, so public and private, international and domestic. And it's also broken down by major economic sectors in the blue colors on the outside, as well as emphasizing the flows from developed to developing countries, which is in the inner layers of the onion, in the green colors with UNFCCC funds at its core. This is a representation we have included ever since the first biennial assessment. So if we then actually go to the global climate finance flows and how they have been, what are the trends for 2017-18, it shows an increase by 16% of the period 2017-18 compared to the last biennial assessment, and it's about to $775 billion per year on average. Sorry, I need to read the numbers every time. Most of this is actually as a major driver, the renewable energy and sustainable transport investments, as this has increased and substantially. But also the continued decreases in renewable energy technology costs means new investments actually goes further. Such that in 2018, 100% more renewable energy capacity was commissioned than in 2012, with only a 22% increase in investments. Then from the key finding around the flows from developed to developing countries, first the climate finance increased through the various channels. We've identified the most important ones here. So the climate-specific financial support from 23 Annex II parties reporting to the convention increased by 13% to an annual average of $36.3 billion. The UNFCCC funds and multilateral climate funds project approvals increased by 39% in that period. At the same time, there were drops in replenishment to GEF and GCF over the period. And then finally, also the MDBs increased their own climate finance to developing and emerging economies by 15% in 2015-2016, and about $25 billion per year is attributed to flowing from developed countries. Also important to realize is that support for mitigation remains greater than for adaptation across all channels, with adaptation amounting between 20 to 25%. And some other interesting findings include that grants continue to be a key instrument for particularly adaptation finance, and that access to climate finance remains a significant challenge. The report, as it is already the fourth report, includes also more information on private finance flows to developing countries, the South-South climate finance flows to LDCs and SIDS, as well as the recipient's perspective. So those are the trends we are trying to capture every time a bit more during each biennial assessment. Now, it's also very important to see climate finance in the right context. We call this the bubble graphic, which we already have. Now it's the second time we have this graphic in there. So although climate finance flows are increasing, they remain relatively small in the broader context of other finance flows, as you can see in this graph. So investment opportunities and the costs, it shows the global climate funds in the context of those flows. In particular, finance flows and stocks in the greenhouse gas intensive activities remain concerningly high. So given the scale and speed needed for a transformation to low greenhouse gas emission and climate resilient development pathways, a sole focus on positive climate finance flows will be insufficient to meet the overarching objectives of the Paris Agreement. Then we go to the new kid on the block, Article 2.1c. I'm pretty sure that most of you might know the exact context and wording, but it's about making financial flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. As you can see in this graph, there has been a significant growth in relevant initiatives that has been apparent since the Paris Agreement entered into force, particularly in coalitions fostering collective commitments on climate action. So this graph really shows the amount of different policy, investors, and cooperative initiatives and how they have grown since 2015 or their inception. So as you can see, many of those activities explicitly refer to achieving the goals of Paris Agreement, and Article 21C are particularly executed through collective initiatives and organizations. This clearly highlights the importance of network effects, knowledge sharing, and common goal setting. In contrast, there is a relatively few relevant actions by national governments that are being framed in Article 21C language. And I mean, for one of the reasons why is also because the importance of the Article 9 context, especially for developing countries who actually provide more information on that part. Then also other findings from the chapter on Article 21C speak to how assessing the real economic impact and the risk of greenwashing remains still a challenge, and therefore measuring the effective role of financial access in the context of Article 21C is a notable topic of debate among initiatives, including which metrics are most important as indicators of success. There, I do want to say that there is more a trend towards those initiatives that include more mandatory implementation requirements against common timelines, as for tracking reasons, implementation and tracking will be quite important to ensure that there is no full greenwashing on this important topic. We also identified that more work is needed to promote the inclusivity and the geographical representation across the various initiatives. And also further consideration of climate resilient development pathways is necessary to complement existing approaches. And finally, it is also important to ensure that just transition financing is incorporated into approaches to align action with the goals of the Paris Agreement or into classification of consistency with those goals, including in supporting vulnerable developing countries at risk of climate impacts in gaining access to capital to support their development. So I've kept it really brief to make sure that I might be able to still respond to one or two questions before asking my colleague from the Secretary to respond to other questions. So giving you back the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vicky, for highlighting the key findings from the 4th Biennial Assessment and the overview of climate finance flows. Colleagues, the floor is open for questions for Vicky. Any questions about the report, the biennial report, are welcome. I'm going to struggle with my eyesight to see who that is. I can't read that country. Oh, European Union. Yeah, it's much easier if you hold them up the other way around. It seems to help with my eyesight if they're level. So for colleagues taking the floor to ask the question, the easiest way is to just keep your mask on and walk up to one of the standing mics and ask your questions that way. If that doesn't work for you for any reason, please just raise your hand and we will get one of the roving mics over to you. If we just stick with the board. Yeah, okay, so unless you're for some reason not able to get to one of the standing mics, please use that as a preference. Thank you. And with the help here of the Secretariat, we are spotting other names from the room. So European Union, please, you're very welcome for your question.
Okay, hello colleagues, good afternoon, and thank you very much to the presenters. So I give also a bit of an introduction. On behalf of the EU and its member states, we welcome the opportunity to participate in the SED2. We thank all presenters in advance for their insights and for being here to provide answers to our questions, to help us better understand the long-term global goal and the process towards it, the mandate we agreed in Madrid, mainly focusing on mitigation. For the EU, it's essential that climate actions are based on the best available science. We therefore appreciate the SED as an important space for a technical dialogue between parties and experts. We have three questions to the speakers, and I'm afraid I have to come back, and now I have my question for the...
Yeah, please, just the question for Vicky.
The question is, has there been any change in efficiency of delivery per dollar of climate finance provided? That's the question.
Thank you, and you'll be welcome to come back into this discussion with your other questions. Thank you. So, Vicky, maybe note that one down, and we'll just take a couple more. So I saw, who I saw next was Nepal and then Norway. So Nepal, you are welcome to take the floor. Can you get out of where you are? India, I see you now, sir. Thank you. I couldn't quite see your and Saudi Arabia, I've seen you. So was the delegate from Nepal wanting to ask a question? Would you like to come up?
I don't think so.
I can see you were the second flag that I saw. You're very welcome. Do you want to come up to one of the microphones to ask your question? Oh, not a question. Okay. Norway, I saw next. Nope. Okay. Japan? No. Okay. The colleague from India is ready, so let's have your question, please, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. India welcomes information on climate finance. The first, we want to know with regard to the finance flows, how much of it is from developed to developing countries, is A, from public sources, B, how much of it is in terms of loans rather than grants, C, what is the average and distribution, the mean and the distribution of the interest that is charged on these loans. D, we want to know to what extent co-financing has been by the host developing country has been made a conditionality to the sanctioning of the grant or loan. Co-financing works in both cases. This is a first set of questions. We also have, with a reference to Article 21C, how much finance to existing projects in developing countries have been curtailed, stopped, truncated, or dissuaded over the last 5 years by invoking Article 21C. India would like to note that Article 21C does not override equity. It does not override common but differentiated responsibilities. It does not override what is in the Paris Agreement about climate justice and equitable access to sustainable development. So we would like to know the breakup of not only coal, but also oil and gas projects for which financing has been denied across developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, delegate from India. I saw the United States on this side. So if you still want to ask a question, please just make sure your flag is visible. Brazil, is your flag resting, or do you have a question? Resting, okay. So if you put them up on front of the chair in front of you, it's easier for me to see them. Fiji, I see you, and Panama. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to
Welcome.
our colleague for presenting. Just a quick question for you. So since this is the first time that the biennial assessment has mapped financial information relevant to Article 21C, can you talk about the biggest takeaways and how public and private institutions are working to align with the Paris Agreement, including a sense of scale of these efforts? Thank you.
Thank you very much, United States. So Vicky, that's a lot. So let's take a pause there so you can have a go at those, realizing that your time is running out. So yeah, over to you.
Thank you, because it's just 4 o'clock and I arranged the meeting now. I'll take them in order. So first, the question from the EU about, apologies.
Efficiency per dollar.
Efficiency per dollar. I would then actually, I'm not sure if we can go back to the slides, but there you actually have one slide about the global climate finance flows, where it shows that how important the renewable energy and sustainable transport investments have been. And that actually by there has been a continued decrease in these costs. So the renewable energy technology costs have been decreasing, but on the other hand, you do have a huge investments there. So this definitely has helped to show a lot more information. Oh, thank you. That's actually this slide. So you can see that the continued decrease in renewable energy technology costs means new investment goes further. So it definitely has helped on that part. So thank you for your question. On the questions by the representative of India, I would actually have to go a bit more into details, which wasn't possible at this point, but I can show you. You were asking more about numbers about the support provided to developing countries by developed countries. There I can refer back to the annual average for the period 2017-18. It's an average of $36.3 billion provided by the 23 Annex II parties, which is actually an increase by 13%. There were also other questions about the instruments, so the loans and the grants. Again, I want to stress that especially one of the key findings is as well that the grants are quite important and stay important for the adaptation finance. As time is a bit limited, I would also refer to the SCF side event that we have on Wednesday, which actually provides more information because we can go into much more detail than is possible at this stage. So, and of course, like I said, the summary and the technical report are available on the website from the SCF. So the information will be made available there. And then very quickly on the question by the colleague or representative of the US about the Article 2.1c and to provide more numbers. They changed it again. There, like I gave the information about the Article 2.1c, and just to give you, for instance, that the investor initiatives, such as the Climate Action 100+, have increased their support by 150% in terms of assets. And if you put that on numbers, that would be about $55 trillion US dollars, which is 50% more than before the Paris Agreement. And also, for instance, the corporate initiatives, which include the setting of science-based targets, have increased by 330%, and that translates into market capitalization to $20.5 trillion. So yes, those numbers are quite difficult to capture, but it does show the importance. Perhaps one more comment. I agree with the colleague from India that Article 2.1c has its own thing, but it's not there to replace anything else. So happy to further engage with you bilaterally if you want to keep talking about that. But I do really have to go now.
No. So Vicky, thank you so much. Your colleague from the Secretariat might want to, Porig, might want to just take your seat and see if we can quickly answer some of the other questions that I saw in the room. But we note that on Wednesday there is a side event for the Standing Committee on Finance where you can continue to ask more questions on the specifics of what's on the report, and the report obviously is available on the website. So I'm just going to invite questions from Fiji and Panama, who are both looking to take the floor. And then we will move on to hear from our colleagues from the Ipcc. India, sir, if it's okay, we'll hear from the others who haven't asked a question first. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, we would like to thank the Standing Committee for Finance for the presentation. And the report is clear that support for mitigation measures remains greater as compared to support for adaptation. Could you provide additional information on the information in your assessment on adaptation finance and how it relates to finance for loss and damage? This is a critical issue for many countries, particularly the vulnerable small island nations. And we'd also like to ask the authors if the report contains information on finance instruments such as debt for climate swaps. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the delegate for Fiji for those questions. Panama, sir.
Good afternoon, colleagues. It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Tara and Gao, for so gracefully engaging with us and for all the opportunities that we had virtually in the past. It is great to see you finally in person. Colleagues, my question is very direct, and I am speaking on behalf of ILAC as Ambition Coordinator. And the question is it reasonable to assume that if we do not start now, with a complete transformation of the financial system in line with the 1.5 goal and the objective to increase resilience, we're basically failing humanity and setting ourselves for failure. And I would also like to ask the presenters, do you have any concrete examples of the actions that parties must start taking now in order to start this transformation, especially the largest emitters and developed countries? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Panama, sir. Can I verify whether Saudi Arabia had a question or not? Sir, you did. Please, you're welcome. And Bhutan, did you also want to ask a question? No? Okay. So, Saudi Arabia, sir.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the informative presentation. I'm speaking on behalf of the Arab group. I have two questions. On the second slide, you have mentioned a bunch or a set of technological solution. However, it wasn't so much clear on other, technological solutions such as the CCS, CCS, or any other technological solution. What is the climate finance flows to those technologies? My second question is also on the third slide, which you clearly mentioned that there is a gap in the support, between the mitigation and the adaptation. My question is why such gap still exists, and what is it that the developed countries doing, to address such gap? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So we're going to go to our colleague from the Secretariat to get answers to those three sets of questions, and then we will move on to the next presentation. Panama, I might just note that I think it is beyond the scope of the colleague from the Secretariat to propose concrete examples of the actions needed to save humanity. I think that is the conversation we all need to share together. But if anything is specific there in the area of finance, then Padraig, you're welcome. And if you can keep things as succinct as possible, that would be great, just in the interest of time. Thank you. Brazil, you did want to. Okay.
Thank you very much, Tara. I think it's good to note that the Biennial assessment is a meta-analysis. It takes published information from the literature as widely as possible into the themes of the report across the chapters. So there's not a lot of original analysis in the report. It's a lot of compilation of various data points and findings from the research. So on the mitigation question on noting that the mitigation finance remains greater than adaptation finance, this is true across the various channels, including bilateral channels, multilateral climate funds, and multilateral development bank flows. How this finance relates to loss and damage is still one of the relatively early topics about finding what data is out there on finance flows towards loss and damage at the moment. There is some discussion of this point in the assessment chapter of the Biennial assessment, so I would encourage you to check that, especially as it relates to the financial instruments related to addressing loss and damage. And this goes to your second question about the debt for climate swaps. There is also a box in the assessment chapter that talks to how instruments to manage the cost of debt or any increase related to the cost of debt for developing countries or their access to capital on the financial markets. There is a box in chapter 3 that does speak to research that has been done in this area. At the moment, there isn't any particular number or headline figures around this at the moment, but there are a lot of continuing studies in the area that we would look to see if we can include in future Biennial assessments. On the question from the Arab group, it is indeed the other technology solutions would be included in some sectors. We do rely a lot on this data from other studies and other reports that have been done that have done climate finance tracking on a global level. So if those studies do include different technologies or how they classify the solutions to include as climate finance, we would try to include them. But from what I can remember from the report, there isn't a huge amount going into those other technological solutions. There is a lot going into renewable energy, into sustainable transport, and into energy efficiency, which includes investments going into industry as well as buildings. And then on the second part of the question about why the gap between mitigation and adaptation finance exists, it is definitely a case where you have to kind of look at the context of the source of the flows as well as the destination of the flows and the types of projects that are financed. So in the slide that was on the screen, it showed that the proportions across different channels. So for example, the multilateral development banks, which make a lot of loans to infrastructure projects, which for the vast majority are in the mitigation space. They're very highly expensive, capital-intensive projects like renewable energy projects, whereas in the adaptation space, they can be smaller projects, very impactful, but they have a smaller capital layout required. So that is one element that goes into the gap. But in the bilateral channels, there is less of a gap between the mitigation and adaptation, and in the multilateral climate funds as well. I will also perhaps ask parlay the question from Panama onto perhaps our Ipcc colleagues. Thank you.
Or maybe the heads of state, maybe they're the appropriate ones for that question. Thank you. And Brazil, sorry, I misunderstood earlier. So you had your flag up. Please, you're welcome to come up and take the floor and ask your question. And then after Brazil, we're going to move on to the next presentation. India, sir, you'll have time to come back again in the general discussion. Yeah, colleague from Brazil, you're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Co-Facilitator, and thank you for allowing me to put a very quick question in the end of this setting. I would like to follow up on the Indian question about, I understood that India asked how much finance from developed to developing countries are coming from public resources. I would like to reiterate this question. We appreciate if the Secretariat could provide the numbers regarding public resources. And I would like to take advantage on the question about gap between mitigation and adaptation and ask if it would be possible to provide how much of the finance from public resources are being channeled to mitigation and how much of the public resources are coming to adaptation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Brazil. So Padraig, to get this clarity on how much of the international climate finance is public versus private, were you able to conclude in the report?
Well, for the international public finance, there are the different channels that we refer to. So in the bilateral channels, the Annex 2 parties, 23 Annex 2 parties that have reported for the years 2017 and 2018, they have provided on average 36.3 billion in climate-specific finance through bilateral channels, as they reported in their fourth biennial reports. And that was the 13% increase from the 2015-2016 period that you saw on the slide. Then in the multilateral climate funds, they provided on average 2.7 billion per year in the 2017-2018 period to projects in developing countries. And through the multilateral development banks, they provided on average, about the total of the multilateral development banks is around between 34 billion in 2017 and 42 billion in 2018. But how much of that is calculated as being attributed to developed countries is calculated at approximately 25 billion per year in 2017 and 2018. The proportions, as I referred to earlier, for mitigation and adaptation differ between those different channels. And because they are different data sources and different ways of looking at the issue, we don't actually make an attempt to aggregate across those different channels.
And have you been able to have a number on the amount of private sector finance, or is it, because it isn't reported in the same way, is that still a guesswork?
From developed to developing?
Yeah.
There are two types of numbers on private finance. There are the mobilized private finance by public sources, and that number, I believe, is around 14 billion per year on average in 2017-2018. And then there are other private finance projects or investments that have been made in developing countries where the information is available and it's known that the private finance has originated from a developed country. But those numbers aren't as solid as some of the other ones. And they can range from 5 billion to 10 billion, depending on how many projects are done in the year.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Okay, thank you very much for those answers. Colleagues, we're going to move on because we have an esteemed panel of Ipcc authors with us. Oh, India, sir, yes, okay, if you insist, just before we move on. And remember, there is time to come back again in the general discussion, which we want to keep ample time for as directed by the parties.
Co-facilitator, we are constrained to intervene. The structured expert dialogue is the outcome of a mandated process that flows from a decision. It is not an exchange offered casually. So when information on questions whose answers we seek are not available, we do not see the referring us to a later side event for more numbers as a reasonable response. We would also like to note that we are certainly flexible. We do appreciate that all the questions we may ask, the numbers may not be available to hand. We would await the answers, but to say that we will then speak to you bilaterally does not meet the needs of the process we are going through. So I hope we will keep in mind the reason why we are here and the conditions and the circumstances in which we have the dialogue. Thank you for your patience, Co-Facilitator.
Thank you, sir. And you are, of course, right. Our job is to bring new information which fills gaps in our previous knowledge and to identify any further gaps in our knowledge that can inform the periodic review and future reviews. So you're quite right. One key thing we need to do as co-facilitators, with your help, is to have an eye and an ear out for what are the missing pieces of information. So clearly from what the Secretariat just said, we know that there are still gaps in information, for example, around private sector funding, because we don't record that information in the same ways as we do public sector finance, and there are gaps. I think what's clear from your report is that we have better information than we've ever had to date, but there are still gaps, and the more that in time we can fill those gaps, the better understanding we will have to be able to answer the wealth of questions that the colleague from India had. So thank you very much. We are now going to turn to invite Valérie Masson-Delmotte, from co-chair of the Ipcc Working Group 1. We had hoped she would be joined by Mr. Panamo Jai, but he hasn't been able to connect with us, but they have prepared together. He is here in spirit. So co-chairs of the Ipcc Working Group 1. Ms. Masson-Delmotte will start the presentation, well actually she'll fully deliver the presentation here from Glasgow live, and then in addition we have a delegation of Ipcc authors joining us down the table there. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves as they take the floor to answer your questions. Or Valerie, you might wish to introduce your colleagues. That might be a nice thing to do. But what is important here is we have a whole range of experts and authors who can respond to all of your questions. But let's pass now to Valerie for the presentation from the Ipcc. Again, to stress that this is the work of the Ipcc Working Group 1, responding directly to the themes of the second periodic review. There is obviously a whole lot more to the story and lots more information that we can deal with in subsequent SBSTA Ipcc events as well. So Valerie, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your invitation. So I will start by stressing that the scale of the widespread and rapid observed changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere all across the climate system is unprecedented over many centuries to many thousands of years. And human influence on the climate system is assessed as unequivocal. Let's focus on one key indicator of the state of the climate, the change in global surface temperature. As you see, global surface temperature has reached 1.1 degrees Celsius in the past 10 years, above the 1850-1900 level. Methodological advances and new data sets contribute approximately 0.1 degrees Celsius to the updated estimate of warming compared to the fifth assessment report. Further warming has been recorded since 2003, 2012, adding around 0.2 degrees to the warming corresponding to the time of the 5th assessment report. Our best estimate is that all of human-induced warming, here with a gray bar, is equal to the outcome of human-induced warming, the dark red bar. Observed warming is driven by emissions from human activities, with greenhouse gas warming, the light red bar, partly masked by the aerosol cooling, the blue bar. While natural variability plays almost no role in centennial global warming, it has a large effect at regional and decadal scales. Our understanding of human influence is strengthened by combining two lines of evidence, here from attribution studies, and from the assessment of radiative forcing and climate sensitivity. Warming to date is primarily driven by emissions of carbon dioxide, which also drives ocean acidification. Our report shows a large role of methane emissions when accounting for its direct and indirect heat-trapping effects. Since 2013, human-caused radiative forcing has increased by around 20%, which is driven by the increase in atmospheric concentration in greenhouse gases and the recent decrease in the global cooling effect of pollution particles, aerosols. The aerosol cooling effect is dominated by emissions of sulfur dioxide. It has peaked at the global scale in the late 20th century with contrasted regional patterns. Human-induced climate change is already affecting every region on Earth in multiple ways, and the change we experience will increase with further warming. Let's now move to the assessment of possible future global surface temperature trends. In this report, we use a core set of 5 illustrative scenarios to explore the climate response to a broad range of greenhouse gas, land use, and air pollutant futures. They span a broader range of greenhouse gas and air pollutant futures than assessed in our previous 2013 report. High and very high CO2 emission scenarios do not include climate change mitigation, with CO2 emissions doubling from current levels by 2050 and 2100. The likelihood of the very high emission scenario is considered low in light of recent developments in the energy sector. In the intermediate CO2 emission pathway, CO2 emissions remain close to today's level during several decades before slowly declining. The low and very low CO2 emission scenarios correspond to fast and very fast declines in global CO2 emissions, reaching net zero CO2 around or after 2050, followed by varying levels of net negative CO2 emissions. They also include fast declines in other greenhouse gas emissions. These scenarios include a wide span of future air pollution control measures. The scenarios account for solar variability and background volcanic activity, but do not include the unpredictable but likely occurrence of a major volcanic eruption. For the first time in an Ipcc report, the assessed future change in global surface temperature consistently combines scenario-based projections with 3 different approaches using observational constraints, as well as the updated assessment of equilibrium climate sensitivity and transient climate response. A major scientific advance reflected in this report is the reduction of the long-standing uncertainty range for climate sensitivity. This arises from the broad agreement across multiple lines of evidence, including paleoclimate information, as well as climate feedbacks and their dependence on climate states. Let's now look at the most likely outcome for each of the 5 illustrative scenarios. In all cases, our best estimate is that, averaged over 2021 to 2040, global surface temperature will reach 1.5 degrees Celsius. This implies that by the 2030s, every single year has a 50% chance of having an annual global surface temperature above that level. For the intermediate scenario, our best estimate is that global surface temperature, averaged over 20 years, would reach 2 degrees in around 2050 and around 2.7 degrees Celsius, with a 66% range from 2.1 to 3.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, and 3.3 degrees Celsius with a range from 2.3 to 4.6 degrees Celsius by 2300. The last time global surface temperature was sustained at or above 2.5 degrees Celsius was over 3 million years ago. However, if deep reductions in CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions occur in the coming years and continue over decades, as reflected in the illustrative low and very low emission scenarios, warming can remain well below 2 degrees Celsius or close to 1.5 degrees Celsius. With every increment of global warming, the pattern of observed temperature trends intensifies in every region. The land surface will continue to warm 1.4 to 1.7 times more than the ocean surface, and the Arctic more than 2 times the rate of global warming. You can see here a visual from our interactive atlas. Let's look at that for precipitation patterns. With every increment of global warming, annual mean precipitation is projected to increase over high latitudes, the equatorial Pacific and parts of monsoon regions, but decrease over parts of the subtropics and some areas in the tropics. Changes in soil moisture are affected by changes in precipitation and increased evapotranspiration in a warmer climate, leading to increased aridity in several regions. Continued global warming is projected to further intensify the global water cycle, including its variability and the severity of wet and dry events, wet and dry seasons. You can see examples of animations from our online interactive atlas, where you can make your own visualizations of climate data sets assessed in our report for different levels of warming, time horizons, reference periods, and scenarios. To summarize, many changes in the climate system become larger in direct relation with the level of global warming. Every increment of warming causes increases in the intensity and frequency of hot extremes and marine heat waves. For instance, events that occurred once per 50 years in 1850 to 1900 already occur 5 times more frequently. It would be 9 times for a level of warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius and 14 times at 2 degrees. It's also the case for the frequency and intensity of heavy precipitation events. Their intensity increases by around 7% per degree Celsius. It's also the case for drought in some regions. Snow cover, Arctic sea ice, and surface permafrost diminish with further warming. So that's what directly scales with the level of global warming, but we've already set in motion snow components of the climate system. Glaciers are committed to continue melting for decades or more. Changes are irreversible on centennial and longer timescales for global ocean temperature, deep ocean acidification, and loss of oxygen. Let's focus on one outcome of slow components, global mean sea level rise. Again, for the first time in an Ipcc report, the assessed future change in global mean sea level rise consistently combines climate, ice sheet, and glacier simulations with the assessed climate sensitivity. Let's first look at sea level projections on this century. Sea level rise is already accelerating now. By 2050, sea level is committed to rise by 15 to 30 centimeters above present-day levels. Beyond 2050, sea level will continue to rise, but with a rate and magnitude strongly dependent on future greenhouse gas emissions. By lowering greenhouse gas emissions and limiting the level of future global warming, we also increase the chance of avoiding triggering irreversible instabilities in ice sheets that could substantially increase sea level rise. Deep uncertainty remains associated with Antarctic ice sheet instability processes. For very high emissions and large warming levels, we cannot rule out a low probability outcome where rapid ice sheet loss could lead to 2 meters sea level rise by the end of the century. Let's now look further in the future, by year 2300. As you can see, low greenhouse gas emissions would lead to a sea level rise of several meters, while very high greenhouse gas emissions could lead to 2 to 7 meters of rise and potentially many meters more when accounting for ice sheet instability processes. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions allows to reduce the magnitude of changes and gives more time for coastal responses. For instance, in our best estimate, a level of 1 meter above present day would be reached by the middle of next century if emissions stay close to today's level for a few decades, and it would be around 40 years later for lower emissions. As you see, the multiple changes experienced in every region and the long-term committed changes increase with further warming. Some changes can be slowed and others can be stopped by limiting warming. For each illustrative scenario, you see the assessed total warming by the end of this century, the dark bar showing warming to date, the light bar showing total warming. It is dominated by the effect of CO2 emissions, the second bar for each scenario, the effect of other greenhouse gases, and the effect of aerosols and land use change, the last bar for each scenario. Future emissions cause future additional warming, with total warming dominated by past and future CO2 emissions. This report reaffirms with high confidence the finding that there's a near linear relationship between cumulative anthropogenic CO2 emissions and the global warming they cause. This relationship implies that reaching net zero CO2 emissions is a requirement to stabilize human-induced global temperature increase at any level, and as a result, limiting global temperature to a specific level would imply limiting cumulative CO2 emissions to within a specific carbon budget. Over the period 1850 to 2019, a total of 2,390 gigatons CO2 was emitted due to human activities. Estimated remaining carbon budgets are provided in the report, calculated from the beginning of 2020 and until global net zero CO2 emissions are reached. Remaining carbon budgets have been estimated for several global temperature levels, various levels of probability, based on the updated estimated value of the transient response to cumulative emissions with a narrower uncertainty again, updated estimates of historical warming I've described, variations in projected warming from non-CO2 emissions, and accounting for climate system feedbacks such as CO2 emissions from thawing permafrost, as well as the estimated of almost zero temperature change after global anthropogenic CO2 emissions reach net zero. So the factors that determine estimates of the remaining carbon budgets have been reassessed, and updates to these factors since the SR15 Ipcc special reports are small. When adjusted for emissions since previous reports, the estimates of remaining carbon budgets are of similar magnitude. Our report also shows that under scenarios with increasing CO2 emissions, the ocean and land carbon sinks are projected to be less effective at slowing the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere. While the natural land and ocean carbon sinks are projected to take up, in absolute terms, a progressively larger amount of CO2 and higher compared to lower CO2 emission scenarios, they become less effective. It means that the proportion of emissions taken up by the land and ocean decreases with increasing cumulative CO2 emissions. This results in a higher proportion of emitted CO2 remaining in the atmosphere. Our report also flags that the magnitude of feedbacks between climate change and the carbon cycle become larger and more uncertain in high CO2 emission scenarios. There are additional ecosystem responses to warming not fully included in climate models, such as CO2 and methane fluxes from wetlands, permafrost thaw, especially abrupt thaw, and wildfires. And these would further increase concentrations of these gases in the atmosphere. By contrast, under very low or low greenhouse gas emission scenarios, where CO2 emissions peak and decline during this century, land and oceans begin to take up less carbon in response to declining atmospheric CO2 concentrations. So a clear message from this report is that limiting human-induced warming requires limiting cumulative CO2 emissions, reaching at least net zero CO2 emissions, along with strong reductions in emissions of other greenhouse gases. The report stresses that strong, rapid, and sustained reductions in methane emissions would also limit the warming effect resulting from declining aerosol pollution and would improve air quality. We see here the difference between the intermediate, low, and very low greenhouse gas emission scenarios in terms of air quality and temperature effects by 2040 and the end of the century. In the low emission scenarios, assumed reductions in aerosol emissions lead to a net warming, while reductions in methane and other ozone precursor emissions lead to a net cooling. Because of the short lifetime of both methane and aerosols, these climate effects partially counterbalance each other, and therefore reductions in methane emissions also contribute to improved air quality by reducing global surface ozone. In the long term, the net additional warming effect due to short-lived climate forces is lower in scenarios assuming air pollution controls, combined with strong and sustained methane emission reductions. I will finish by addressing the following questions. When would we see the benefits of reduced greenhouse gas emissions? Scenarios with very low or low greenhouse gas emissions lead within years to discernible effects in greenhouse gas and aerosol concentrations and air quality relative to high or very high greenhouse gas emission scenarios. For global surface temperature, differences in 20-year trends would emerge during the near term under very low emission scenarios relative to a high or very high emission scenario. The response of many other climate variables would emerge from natural variability at different times along the century. By the end of the century, scenarios with low or very low greenhouse gas emissions would strongly limit the increase in the frequency of extreme sea level events, heavy precipitation and pluvial flooding, and exceedance of dangerous heat thresholds illustrated here, while limiting the number of regions where such exceedances occur relative to scenarios with intermediate or higher emissions and higher warming levels. To conclude, the report shows how much the climate we experience in the future in every region depends on our decisions now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valerie. Sobering stuff there, but also great new information to help us better understand the long-term global goal, the scenarios to help us achieve it, the gaps that we filled in knowledge and the gaps in knowledge that are remaining. Colleagues, we've had to juggle around the agenda a bit to accommodate different speakers, and we started a half an hour later than anticipated too. So what I'm thinking might be good is to hear from Anne from UNEP, who has traveled a long way to be with us today, thank you, and made it just in time. We might hear from Anne, because I think the two presentations are very complementary. And then we'll have the full richness, because I just think there's going to be so many questions that then we get to go off in a great conversation, but with the full knowledge of all that we're going to hear. So what I'm going to suggest is that, Anne, we give the floor to you. Anne has a 7-minute-ish presentation for us on the UNEP emissions gap report, which has just come out. So Anne, let's go to you, and then colleagues, we'll be back to you, and we'll be able to take questions from then till 6:30, which is a great opportunity.
Thanks very much, Tara, and thank you all for being here today. I'm going to tell you or show you some of the key findings from the just released emissions gap report by UNEP. And I just want to start by saying the reason why I'm not including findings from the adaptation gap report is that the 2021 report is coming out on Thursday the 4th at 10:30, so it's still under embargo. I will do my best if you have questions related to the adaptation gap report to also answer those. So this is the 12th UNEP emissions gap report produced as an annual science-based assessment to inform the international discussions on climate change. And this year, of course, has been particularly interesting from an emissions gap perspective because it's the first time since the adoption of the Paris Agreement that countries have actually been asked to submit new or updated nationally determined contributions as part of the 5-year ambition raising cycle of the Paris Agreement. Furthermore, one of the key goals this year of the COP presidency is to ensure global net zero emissions around the middle of the century to keep 1.5 degrees within reach. So what we will focus on and what I'll try to run very quickly through here is, first of all, as always, we look at the latest trends in global greenhouse gases. Then we'll focus a bit more on the impact of the submitted and also announced mitigation pledges, both on 2030 emissions and also on the emissions gap. And then we'll look at the implications for global warming at the end of the century, and Valerie already showed us those under different scenarios. Then we look briefly into the status of net zero emissions pledges and also whether the near-term actions and targets for 2030 are aligned with these long-term pledges. And finally, as we always do in the emissions gap report, we look into different important areas or opportunities for bridging the gap. And this year we do an update on the status of COVID-19 fiscal recovery measures and the extent to which they actually contribute to accelerating a green transition. We look into the role of reducing methane emissions in bridging the emissions gap. And finally, we look into the role of market mechanisms. So very quickly, we saw last year that global greenhouse gas emissions dropped, or basically that CO2 emissions dropped last year by an unprecedented 5.4%. We don't have data for all greenhouse gases yet, but we expect that the drop in total greenhouse gas emissions will be smaller than the drop in CO2 emissions. And we also see a strong rebound coming in 2021, which all in all means that the expected emissions this year are likely to be only a little bit smaller than they were in the record high of 2019. If we then look at the new and updated nationally determined contributions by the cutoff date used in the report, which was the end of September 2021, we had 121 parties covering more than half of global emissions had actually communicated new or updated NDCs. What we see in these is about half of these lower 2030 emissions. Just under 20% imply equal or higher emissions, not necessarily because they're not more ambitious than the previous ones, but there could be underlying differences in accounting and so forth. And then finally, the effect of the remaining NDCs is unclear because they are not directly comparable to their prior NDCs. And that's generally because the new NDCs are more transparent and more of them also include greenhouse gas emissions target than the prior ones. So we do see some progress, but the aggregate impact of the mitigation pledges on projected global greenhouse gases is relatively limited. And this slide basically shows you the contributions by each of the G20 members, also the non-G20 members, and also we look in the report not only at the submitted new or updated NDCs, but we also look into announced mitigation pledges as of 30 September, including China, Japan, and the Republic of Korea, some of which have now actually been submitted as NDCs formally. So if we look at the new updated unconditional NDCs, they result in reductions of global emissions of just under 3 gigatons of CO2 equivalents in 2030 compared with the previous NDCs. And if we include the announced pledges, this reduction increases to just over 4 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. Before we go into the gap, let's just look at the changes in the scenarios that we consider in the report compared with last year's report. So we see that current policies have decreased in 2030 by 4 gigatons of CO2 equivalents. That's basically more or less half and half due to the impact of COVID-19 and of recent policies. Then we see that the impact of the announced and submitted 2030 pledges is also about 4 gigatons of CO2. And finally, there were some updates in the underlying scenarios compatible with 2 degrees, 1.8 degrees, and 1.5 degrees, where the two former have been updated and lead to 2 gigaton CO2 equivalent lower emission levels for 2030. So all in all, what we can see is that the emissions gap in 2030 remains large. What this graph shows you is basically the good part of the story is that if we compare with the 2010 policy scenarios, which basically shows you what would emissions be hitting in 2030 if no new climate policies had been adopted since 2010. You do see the effect of current policy scenarios. We are moving towards a considerably lower level of global CO2 emissions, also greenhouse gas emissions in 2030. We also see that there is an effect of the unconditional and conditional NDCs, but that the remaining gap is large. So even if the unconditional and conditional NDCs are fully implemented, we will be looking at a gap of 11 to 13 gigatons of CO2 equivalents in 2030 with respect to a 2-degree limit, and of 25 to 28 gigatons of CO2 equivalents with respect to a 1.5 degree target. So compared to the prior NDCs, the new unconditional NDCs and announced pledges shave off 7.5% of global emissions in 2030, but we would be needing 4 times higher ambition level to get on track to 2 degrees and 7 times higher ambition level to get on track to 1.5 degrees. This does not take into account the net zero emission pledges, which have by now firm pledges have been made by 50 parties, also covering more than half of global greenhouse gas emissions. And here you can see a global snapshot and a G20 snapshot of these pledges. What is important to note here is that many of them still have some ambiguities, both in terms of the sectors and gases covered, in terms of whether they include offsets, and also in terms of transparency regarding the plans, both for achieving them and also for reporting and reviewing progress towards them. Nevertheless, what we see is that if we look at the global warming implications at the end of the century, we estimate in the report that if we continue the level of ambition implied by current policies over the course of the century, we would end with around a global warming of about 2.8 degrees with a 66% chance at the end of the century. Unconditional NDCs lowers this by 0.1 degrees Celsius to 2.7 degrees Celsius. But the real change is if we both get the unconditional NDCs and the net zero targets implemented, then the global warming implications or estimates are lowered to about 2.2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. But first of all, we need to get there. And if we look at the G20 members that account for about 76% of global emissions, they are, as a group, not on track to achieve either their original 2030 pledges or the new ones. I'm going to move fast through this to keep the time. And also, if we look at the G20 members' 2030 pledges, in the context of the long-term net zero emissions pledges, we see that few of them put the countries on a clear path towards net zero. So there's an urgent need to enhance ambition and to accelerate action, both to bridge the gap in 2030, but also to bring global emissions on a credible path towards net zero by around mid-century. Then we look into the opportunities to bridge the gap. And if we look at COVID-19 fiscal measures, we see that approximately up until the end of May, approximately $16.7 trillion was spent on COVID-19 related both rescue and recovery packages. Of this, $2.25 trillion is considered as recovery spending, so about 1/8 of the total, and only around 17 to 19% of that is likely to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So there's still an opportunity lost here in terms of using this COVID-19 fiscal recovery measures and spending to accelerate a green transition. If we look at methane, and we already heard a little bit from Valerie about that, of course, reducing methane emissions can contribute to bridging the gap by slowing down the rate of warming in the short term, also by reducing peak warming throughout the century, and as I said, help bridge the emissions gap. And there seems to be an untapped potential here, because the current NDCs only cover a fraction of the methane reduction that's required to be consistent with a 2 and 1.5 degree goal. Key opportunities lie in reducing emissions from fossil fuels, from agriculture, and from waste. And an increasing number of the countries are looking into methane emission reductions in their NDCs, but there's still scope to increase this considerably. Then finally, we look into the role of market mechanisms in bridging the gap. And the main finding of the report is that carbon markets can deliver real emissions abatement, but only if rules are clearly defined and also designed to ensure that transactions reflect actual reductions in emissions and that they're supported by arrangement to track progress and provide transparency. I'm going to end here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Anne. So much to take in there. And so much that directly helps us to address the themes of the structured expert dialogue, looking both at enhancing our understanding of the long-term global goals, scenarios towards achieving it, the challenges and opportunities as you looked at there, but also on theme 2, where we assess the overall aggregated effect of the steps taken by parties to achieve that long-term goal. So you've shown where we have work to do, in which sectors, really building on what the Ipcc presented to us, which was very much within theme 1 and showing us and helping us better understand what the long-term global goal means to us. So now we're going to have ample time, I am delighted, for a discussion. Just a few things I need to tell you before I take your questions. So the floor will be open. Please do reflect on your questions as they respond to both of the themes of the structured expert dialogue. We have a slide we can put up as well, which shows the guiding questions that we gave to the presenters and which may also be useful to you in thinking through your questions. In line with the protocols under the convention process, I will take questions from parties first, but observers, we would love to hear from you as well. To those who are joining us online, there isn't actually a chat function on the COP platform, so you do need to use the raise your hand function to ask your question. If you do that, that question will come to me on the screen here and we will be able to bring you in. 2 IPC authors were intended to join us online. They haven't been able to do so, but we have a great representation of IPCC authors here with us in the room. So Valerie and her colleagues between them will be able to answer the full richness, and Anne. And remember, we have the Secretariat still here with us as well in terms of the Standing Committee on Finance. So I think that's all I need to say. Again, if you can raise your flags good and high, the Secretariat is helping me to catch the list. If you can use the standing mics to pose your questions, that would be great. I'll take them in probably groups of 3 or 4 and then address them to the authors, or to the experts. Okay, so let's start with India, followed by Panama, and then Antigua and Barbuda. India, sir, you have the floor.
In view of the guiding questions, and in the light of the long discussion that parties have had, separating the purpose of the second periodic review from the global stocktake, on which there was considerable discussion, the UN GAP report seemed to be a preview of the global stocktake. It made no reference to what happened after 2013, 2015. India is extremely concerned to note that the judgment of what is necessary for 1.5 in the UNEP GAP report begins at 2010. And it predates the Paris Agreement. There is a series of graphs where somehow linear reduction by a constant amount of emissions every year. It is suggestively placed as if this is the correct way to reduce. Those parties who by virtue of equity and CBDR are allowed to peak later are characterized as a decelerated approach. And there is the entire exercise has very little to do with the purpose for which we thought we were going through the second periodic review. The second most concerning point is the summary dismissal of equity again by making comparison of what the world should do, of what is clearly placed and described as least cost pathways. These are not acceptable, I think, to parties here. This is not the terms of the the convention. The convention says on the basis of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, but it did not add, as far as we are aware, that by the least cost available. So I think we are extremely concerned with this. The third is an obvious divergence between the science that we see in the UNEP gap report and the science which we just heard, even in the summary form in which it was presented. The UNEP gap report discovers a new science, which they call the science of net zero. This is a science, a new science, which seems to have escaped the notice of the Ipcc. So we would like to know what this science of net zero is. For those of us who read through the text of the report, as our experts have done in India, it is about the concept of carbon budgets. But why would it then be labeled net zero? But again, we return to the first point that we made, that this is the mandate of the GST. NDCs, net zero, LTS are the mandate of the GST. We had a very clear idea about how the pre-2020 roundtable would feed into this process. The UNEP gap report, in this presentation, co-facilitators, we do not see what place it has here in our discussion at all. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And just noting that we did, if you remember in our last session, talk quite a lot about the pre-2020 report, and that remains a source of information to inform the structured expert dialogue. Panama, sir.
Good afternoon again. We want to thank the speakers today for their excellent presentations. ILAG very much welcomes the Working Group 1 contribution to AR6 and wishes to express our deep gratitude to the Ipcc and the global research community as they continue to advance our climate understanding. From the point of view of scholarly science, this report is a huge, huge achievement, and the authors deserve our congratulations for the quality of their work. However, as much as the science is good, the messages are very, very, very bad. We now understand that virtually all our concerns previously identified are in fact more worrying than we thought. Not only has evidence of observed changes to climate systems strengthened, but even if we can stop the temperature increase as soon as it is scientifically feasible to do so, our climate change will continue in their current direction for decades to millennia. Therefore, the need for rapid transformational changes to stay within the 1.5 scenario that we also emphasized a lot during the last SED is even more urgent in light of this Ipcc report. It is absolutely imperative that all countries achieve radical emission reductions to cut global emissions by 45% of 2010 levels by 2030 to avoid a disaster. In this context, I would like to ask the Ipcc experts if it is reasonable to assume that in order to stay within the limit of 1.5, all parties, without exception, must rapidly embark on a pathway of radical emissions reduction towards carbon neutrality by 2050, and that it is not very much the scope for some countries, that there is not a scope for some countries not to reach net zero by 2050. I also would like to apologize as I have to leave the room immediately because I have to meet with my delegation, but my fellow ILAC colleagues will remain here to hear your answers. Once again, thank you very much for your work. This is what we need, and this was a great achievement. Good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Panama. So, Antigua and Barbuda. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacob. Facilitators, colleagues, good afternoon. Speaking on behalf of AOSIS, I would like to take the opportunity to thank everyone on the panel for the presentations and for the Secretariat for convening the second structured expert dialogue. I know these are exceptional circumstances, but we do appreciate the efforts in ensuring that science remain front center for this COP. However, we do have some concerns that we'd like to raise. One being that we're not happy to see Theme 1 and Theme 2 being discussed on the same day because we don't think that it would give enough time to absorb all of the inputs for both themes. Secondly, AOSIS would have hoped that the Ipcc would have been allotted more time for their presentation because for AOSIS, we see this as key importance for the process. And in the 2013 to 2015 review, multiple sessions was spent carefully examining the contents. So we would have loved to see some more time reflected for these reports. Regardless, we would like to highlight that we definitely look forward to the presentations today and tomorrow, and hope that we could come to some sort of amicable conclusion. Now to my questions to the Ipcc. First, I would like to thank the authors for the report, and we do appreciate the clarity of the report and the benefits of limiting the warming to 1.5 versus higher levels where it comes to climate impacts. It would also be helpful that the report gave us information on the type of physical, it would also be useful that the report gives information on the different types of physical climate impacts and relate these impacts to the level of warming. So could you clarify for which of these indicators the science has improved for the from the AR5, providing even more clarity on benefits limiting warming to 1.5. Also, the report makes clear every fraction of warming matters for impact. So not just changes bigger in increments from 2 to 4 degrees. So could more details be provided for this? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Antigua and Barbuda. And just to note that we did get your correspondence via the SBI chair with your queries around the process. A response was sent. I think it was a little late in going, perhaps only today, but it will be there, a written response. And just to say, we have, as a practice in this second periodic review in the Structured Expert Dialogue, looked at Theme 1 and Theme 2 in each session. We've just made sure that we have, in balance, always had equal time for both, and that's something we're very, very committed to. In terms of more time for the Ipcc for presentations, perhaps, but I think what we heard from the parties in previous dialogues and in the feedback we had from you is that you wanted particularly more time for the discussion. This is the Structured Expert Dialogue, so that there was more time for questions and answers. So if you like, the presentations are there to set the context, the high points, the key messages, but then we want this to be an exchange. So that is where we're very much protecting the time to have that exchange. You know, I think we can bring out more details of the content from the different IPCC reports through those questions. We have another 1 hour and 24 minutes for this discussion, this dialogue, which is, I have to say, a great opportunity for us all to learn more and exchange. Okay, so let's take some questions. For UNEP, there's questions from India around how equity is reflected in the UNEP report and how you deal with least cost scenarios. Is that a factor that fed into your considerations, or perhaps even those within the IPCC? And if you have any comments on the science of net zero, I think those are welcome, and then we'll hand over to the IPCC colleagues for the other questions.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'm very fortunate because I can also hand over to Yuri, who sits at the very end of the table, who is one of the lead authors of the emissions gap report. So responding to some of the remarks from India, you can say the emissions gap report is not intended to be a preview of the global stocktake more than it is every single year, because we have been doing the same this year as we've been doing every year since the report started coming out. We look at where we are, we look at where we're heading, and we are focused primarily on the global level, although we also go into more detail on G20 members. So we look at where we are, where we're headed, where we should be headed, and also how we get there. So basically the questions that were also put forward under the Telenoa dialogue, we do not imply that every country needs to follow linear or pre-prescribed projections. In fact, we fully commit to and acknowledge the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. We stay away from equity and fairness discussions, but we refer to their existence. And the least cost pathways, of course, those are for the scenarios that are consistent with 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees and lower degrees. And they actually build on the scenario database of the IPCC. And Yuri, feel free to jump in here. The science of net zero, again, Yuri, feel free to jump in here. It's based on the carbon budgets discussion. That's also very clear in the report. Yuri, do you want to come in?
And Yuri, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself so that we, as each of you take the floor, we learn your name and your role. Thank you. Hang on 1 second, you don't seem to be turned on yet. Try again. We may need to, Danny, can we get that microphone turned on, the one on the end? Oh, here's one coming to you now, Yuri.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, so my name is Yuri Rogel. I'm now answering as lead author of the UNEP emissions gap report. The reasons why, one of the reasons why we compare two least cost mitigation pathway as part of the UNEP emission gap report is not because we are not aware of the other principles that are in the convention, but the convention also clearly states as one of its core principles that policies and measures to deal with climate change should be cost effective so as to assure global benefits at lowest possible cost, which is almost a direct definition of least cost pathways, and therefore we compare to those pathways that are available in the literature.
Great, and did you want to say anything else?
I think that was it, basically.
Okay, because other questions, just Valerie and colleagues then are around, do all countries need to make this transition at the same time, or can some countries take more time than others? Some examples then of the physical climate change impacts we can expect with different levels of warming, and more about how each fraction of warming manifests itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I would like just to clarify two aspects regarding the illustrative scenarios that are associated with, as a result, limiting warming at different levels. There will be much further granularity and much more detailed assessment in the forthcoming Working Group 3 report, which is scheduled for March next year. So we only look in this report at the physical science basis associated with limiting global warming. And regarding the consequences of different levels of global warming in terms of impacts, This is really a focus on the forthcoming Working Group 2 report, which is scheduled for next February. But in this report, we have an innovative aspect, which is to look at what we call climatic impact drivers. This is informed by existing impact studies and vulnerability studies, and it allows to look at characteristics of the physical climate through trends, extremes, or specific indices that are known to drive effects on health or of crop productivity associated with specific heat levels. So in our report, you will see an assessment for specific levels of warming, of the corresponding regional changes in these climatic impact drivers. Some of them over land, and some of them in the ocean, and others for coasts, so that it gives a clearer information of what are the implications for a different context of different warming levels. And now I would like to give the floor first to Piers Forster regarding the insights from this report on net zero, and possibly another of the authors regarding the characteristics of climate consequences for different warming levels. Piers? Can you introduce yourself first?
Okay, yes, good afternoon everyone.
I think maybe you need to pass up the other microphone. I'm not sure that one is turned on, Piers.
Okay, good afternoon everyone. I'm Professor Piers.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Coordinating lead author of Chapter 7 of the Ipcc report. Yeah, I'd like to reply to India, talking about the new science on net zero, and just to say, in the Working Group 1 assessment report, there is a lot of brand new science on net zero that we assess very carefully. The first science is on the zero emission commitment. We have much more certainty that we do not expect the CO2 contribution to kind of global warming to go up once you get to net zero carbon dioxide, and this is considerably more certain than before, and this is in spite of continued thawing from permafrost and wildfire fires. And in the report we also compare the difference between net zero carbon dioxide and net zero greenhouse gases, and if we achieve net zero greenhouse gases, we can expect a kind of peak in temperature and then a decline.
Thank you, Piers. And yeah, please. And please introduce yourself so we all know who you are. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Helene Hewitt. I was the coordinating lead author of the chapter on ocean cryosphere and sea level change. And the question asked about what more we learnt about the other risks if we exceeded 1.5 degrees. So we looked at this specifically in terms of the cryosphere and the sea level risks. If we can stay below or close to 1.5 degrees, there's a much greater chance of maintaining sea ice throughout the summer in the Arctic. If we exceed these levels, ice sheets, both Greenland and the West Antarctic ice sheets, are much closer to being lost over longer timescales. In particular, if we get close to, well above 2 degrees, the chances of ice sheet instability and widespread loss of ice from around Antarctica becomes much more likely. And in the figures, Valerie showed the deep uncertainty associated with high warming levels in sea level rise. And so that's what we're risking. If we go to high warming levels, we can lose a lot of the ice around Antarctica and lead to very high sea level in this century and the coming centuries.
Thank you, Helen. I'll ask, Danny, can we turn on more of the handheld mic so that everybody doesn't have to pass them up and down? Just.
So we need to turn them on because the speakers keep pressing buttons.
Oh, okay.
You don't need to press any buttons.
Okay, just maybe we'll turn them all on so that you don't have to pass them amongst you so much. It would probably be better from a health and safety perspective.
Juni would like to speak.
Yeah, okay, yeah, please. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Juni Lee, coordinating lead author of Chapter 4 on global climate change. Then I'd like to mention that one of the big science advances in this report is the better understand and better predict the extremes on the levels of global warming. For example, if we see the hot extremes for 10-year event compared to their occurrence in the pre-industrial level, under the 1.5 degree warming, there will be 4.1 times more occurrence in this event. And also we have assessment for the drought, heavy precipitation, and also tropical cyclones. And I'd like to emphasize that our interactive atlas provides all the information for those extreme events under the different levels of global warming. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juni. Thank you. I think we got most of the questions there. I'm not sure if we got the ILAC question around, it's related to the carbon budgets and the scenarios. Does every country need to get to zero on the same time scale?
You have to do it? It's not in the Working Group 1 report.
So the Working Group 1 contribution speaks to the geophysical characteristics of halting warming at the global level, where it provides evidence and strengthened evidence that global carbon dioxide emissions need to reach net zero to halt warming. It makes no statement whether this needs to be achieved by each country at the same time. That is not part of the assessment of Working Group 1 AR6. Actually, the UNEP emissions gap report does highlight that this timing will differ between countries depending on their development status and their development path.
Thank you. And I think that's, it also links to the question from Antigua and Barbuda around hearing more from the Ipcc. So just to remind you that the third SED 3, which will take place, we assume, in June of next year, will hear from working groups 2 and 3. So there's more to come from the Ipcc in terms of informing the structured expert dialogue. Thank you, colleagues. Let's take some more questions. India, and I have the list here, and then if I don't call out your name, wave your arm wildly. So I have Bhutan, United Republic of Tanzania, Canada, Japan, Fiji, European Union, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, United States, Norway. Did I not get somebody? India, sir, you'd like to go on the list again, so you're added. Anybody else that I missed? If so, wave. No, okay. So let's take another 3 questions. So Bhutan, please.
Thank you, Madam Co-Facilitator. So on the behalf of least developed countries, Bhutan would like to deeply appreciate the efforts of hundreds of Ipcc authors who have come up with this very important report containing wealth of knowledge. So my question is that in the context of the long-term temperature goal, we understand that it is also very important to know about the near-term benefits of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. We think that the report does an important job in doing just that and consider this key information to comprehensively assess the benefits of scenarios towards achieving the long-term temperature goal. Could the authors elaborate a bit more on the near-term benefits, so within the next 20 years, and what further information on this is available in the report? Thank you very much.
So near-term benefits of limiting warming to 1.5. Thank you. Very clear question. So next we have Tanzania, sir. You're very welcome.
Thank you very much, and I would like to appreciate and thank co-chair of Working Group 1, Valerie, for tremendous work that you are doing with the group and for this wonderful report. My question is that in most countries in Africa, we're already suffering from the extreme events and people are dying. And the report highlights very clearly the threat posed by these extreme events. Yet, in the financial flow, we see that more investment is focused on mitigation as compared to adaptation. Now, my question is, will this report or the message coming from this report try to, call for more enhancement in adaptation to save the life of people who are dying as we are speaking as well? The extreme are increasing. Therefore, that's my question to Valerie. And also, from Anne, you indicated that 2020, there's been a drop in emission of CO2. Now, I was trying to think myself, what is the key message that we are trying to deliver to policymakers? Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, very much. Next, could I invite Canada to take the floor?
Yes, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to our representatives from the SCF, UNEP, and Ipcc for your presentations and for taking the time to be with us here today. My delegation has two questions, particular for our colleagues from the Ipcc, aimed at helping us as policymakers unpack the latest scientific findings relevant to our deliberations here at COP26. So first, at the time of the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees, there was perhaps limited scientific research on what a half-degree difference in global temperature would mean in terms of changes in the climate system. How has the science around this question advanced between SR 1.5 and the recent Working Group 1 report? And the second question, in the summary for policymakers of the Working Group 1 report, figure SPM4 shows emissions paths for individual gases, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, but not the total GHG emission trajectory. Is that information available in Working Group 1? And if so, can you provide any indication of timing of net zero GHG emissions in the lowest emissions scenario? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll take one more from Japan, please. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair, for giving me the floor. And thank you to experts for the informative presentation. I have one question for an expert from UNEP regarding the mobilization of COVID-19 fiscal measures to fill the gap. You pointed out that most recovery spending has been mobilized for immediate rescues, such as employment and worker support programs and healthcare, and only 17 to 19% of the recovery spending is likely to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And my question is, are there any practices that the recovery budget has utilized to cover both urgent issues and greenhouse gas abatement? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, I was struck by that figure myself on reading the slides, the relatively small percentage of COVID recovery funding that has also had a benefit in terms of lowering greenhouse gas emissions. And there's two questions to you. Do you want to take those first, and then we'll go over to the Ipcc colleagues?
Yes, and why don't we mix it up and take them in reverse order? So just responding to the question from Japan. So some of the good practices, actually, I think around 90% of the fiscal recovery measures that are assessed to lower greenhouse gas emissions have been put in place by only 7 countries, G20 countries. And a lot of it has gone into measures that promote clean energy, also clean R&D, transportation that's green, so to speak, or clean, and also quite a lot on energy efficiency. So those are areas that have received a lot of attention by the countries who have actually managed to green their fiscal recovery spending. And yes, it is definitely possible to look at pursuing several objectives at the same time, both the social, economic, and environmental objectives. I'll be happy to provide some more examples bilaterally if relevant. And then there was one question from Tanzania, the drop in CO2 emissions, and what's the key message? To me, at least, the key message is we need structural changes. We saw a near complete lockdown around the globe last year, and it only, I mean, it's a big drop, but it's only 5.4% and only in 1 year. So locking down or shutting down economies is not going to help. We need structural changes. To me, that's the message that stands out. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's such a clear message. Shutting down the economy and society is not the answer. We have to structurally change the way we even warm our homes, produce food, move goods. All of that continued while we were all stuck in our homes. Valerie and IPCC colleagues, quite a range of questions there for you. I know you've noted them all down, and you start with you, Valerie, and then you can pass it on as you wish.
Thank you very much. So to the question from Bhutan on what can be the near-term benefits of ambitious mitigation action, the report shows the possibility to quickly improve air quality through the reductions in emissions of methane, for instance, but also the co-emissions of aerosols associated with the combustion of fossil fuels. And that is something that is clearly stressed in the report, which has a dedicated chapter on short-lived climate forces, which is a novel element within the Working Group 1 assessment. Regarding the questions from Tanzania, I would like to flag that the report provides also a wealth of information on what is the benefit of having co-design processes, building on user knowledge, on user needs, so as from climate services to develop relevant, actionable climate information to inform adaptation. And I really would like to flag the fact that our report shows that advances in basic climate research through improved observations, understanding of natural variability, drivers, and climate responses is part of solutions. And I would like to develop that a bit further. Today, many decisions are still being made by only looking backwards, looking at what has happened, what were the past centennial events. And our report shows that it is possible now to use robust climate information to account for the spread associated with internal variability, so as to use climate information looking forward to inform decision-making, so that to have enhanced risk management and resilience. And the rest of the question was focused on adaptation, which is not part of the Working Group 1 assessment, but I just would like to flag the importance of using climate information for future changes to inform today's adaptation decisions. And I think I will turn to other authors regarding the various aspects. I suggest to give first the floor to Helene regarding new knowledge associated with the responses to different warming levels.
Okay, so talking about the response to different warming levels, so in the report, for example, we show that some of the faster components of the cryosphere, such as the summer Arctic sea ice, snow, and permafrost at least, permafrost depth at least to 3 degrees, is linear with temperature, which really does mean that every bit of warming matters. Other things that have progressed since SR 1.5 is in terms of thresholds for the Greenland ice sheet, where the SR 1.5 had talked about a temperature threshold, but the science has moved on, and now we see it's much clearer that it's a size threshold, and when it gets to a certain size, it will then go much more rapid. When it gets small, it will then go very rapidly. So now I'll move on to Yuri.
Yeah, if I may add something.
Yeah. Okay, you're turned on now.
So compared to what was available at the time of the 1.5 report, I would like to flag a few advances. The fact that we now have a very low emission scenario, which was not available at that time. The fact that there's also more information from regional model results. The use of the climate impact driver framing, which gives a more systematic approach to where we have a robust signal for every additional half a degree of warming at the regional scale and for specific indices. The use also of initialized simulations to provide one more line of evidence of the near-term climate system response, accounting for variability. And the availability of larger ensembles of global climate simulations to also better explore and account for internal variability. And this, in fact, strengthens the conclusion that for every additional half a degree of warming, there are discernible changes in extremes. And the conclusion is strengthened by accounting better for internal variability as well. And then I would like, I think, to turn to Yuri for the questions about total greenhouse gas trajectories.
Yeah, thank you for the question. The IPCC Working Group 1 report does not provide aggregated greenhouse gas emission trajectories, but the special report on 1.5 did, and also the UNEP emissions gap report uses actually the AR6 Working Group 1 climate assessment to reassess the temperature outcomes of deep mitigation pathways, and there are timings of net zero CO2 and net zero greenhouse gases mentioned in the emissions gap report. For example, that would be table 3.1 of the report. Just generally speaking, net zero greenhouse gases are reached around 20 years later than net zero CO2 emissions in deep mitigation pathways consistent with 1.5.
Thank you. Can I ask one follow-up question which might help those in the audience too? Just in terms of thinking through examples that illustrate how every degree of warming matters. Valerie, you were just saying that there are, for certain extremes, you can illustrate that. Can you kind of tell us a story to bring that to life so we can better understand?
So it's what is mentioned in our summary for policymakers is, for instance, the fact that the likelihood of concurrent heat waves and droughts strongly increases for specific levels of warming. And for instance, concurrent extremes affecting key crop-producing areas become more frequent at 2 degrees and above compared to a level of warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that's an example where we don't just look at trends or specific individual extremes, but the rare combination of events that today have a very low likelihood of occurrence, but increase disproportionately with just half a degree more. And the signal is particularly strong for dangerous heat thresholds, like maximum temperature above 35 degrees Celsius, which is known to affect, for instance, maize crop productivity, where the number of days where this type of situation is encountered increases very strongly in multiple regions by something like half a month per additional half a degree of global warming. So that's an example of where we have clearer information now.
Okay, great, thank you. And when we get concurrence of events like heat waves and droughts, does that contribute to the type of wildfire season that we've seen of late?
Yes, so the report shows that we already see an increase in the concurrent increase of conditions associated with extreme hot weather, dry conditions and windy conditions that can lead to wildfire. So this has already increased and strongly increases with any further level of warming in many regions.
Okay, thank you. No, those are just really useful examples to bring that, scary though it is, to life. Let's go on and get a few more questions. So I had Fiji next to take the floor with a question. Thank you, sir. Can I say something too? Because today has been a bit tricky with the Leaders Summit, we haven't been able to provide water for our guests. So I just wanted to say to any of you that need to go and fill up a bottle or get anything, just step down and move. Don't worry, we can be informal about that. If anybody needs to take any other kind of comfort break, go and come back to us. I will hold the fort while you're not here and keep the question for you when you come back. So just because it is 3 hours, so if anybody needs anything of a human rights nature, you're fully in your rights. Fiji, sir.
Thank you, Madam Co-Facilitator. Good afternoon, colleagues. So my question is with respect to sea level rise as well. One of the key aspects where progress was made in the report, in the latest IPCC report, was the inclusion of estimates for sea level rise on timescales beyond 2100. And we would like to thank the authors for providing these estimates. We would also like to thank the presenters for showing the technical summary figure on sea level rise timing, highlighting the slowdown of sea level rise under strong mitigation. The report is clear about many meters of sea level rise that can be avoided with warming of 1.5 degrees versus, for instance, 2.2 degrees Celsius, or even higher in the long term. This really shows that the decisions we take today affect not only our lifetimes and the lifetimes of the next generations, but will determine very survival of our small island states. So my question is, could the authors provide more details on the concept of how low likelihood, high impact outcomes and the chances of avoiding those when limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that would be something that it would be good for all of us to understand a bit better, as it is so significant, in particular for small island states. European Union, please. And I'll be coming to Saudi Arabia next.
I have closed my speaking notes.
Sorry. Take your time, open them up again.
Speaking about comfort, so I'm doing it again, just from where I am. First of all, we want to thank the Ipcc for the wonderful report they have established and all those contributing to it in these challenging times. So thank you very much. In the SPM and also in your presentations, you have talked about the surface temperature rise on the one hand, and about global warming on the other hand. And we would like to understand the difference between the two, how you, the methodology, and has it changed in comparison to the AR5 and the 1.5 report? And also maybe where are we now in terms of temperature rise and warming level? Thank you. And the second question goes to UNEP. In the report, you talk about the emission gap, but the long-term global goal is in terms of temperature. So how did you translate from the emissions to temperature and vice versa? That would be very interesting to know. And maybe you can also talk about the uncertainties when you do that, and if it is related to the choice of socioeconomic scenarios. Thank you very much. And it's very cold in here.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody listening to us can turn down the air conditioning. There aren't so many of us. We're all spaced out. So yeah, they've got that message. Yeah, so it should not remain so cold. Saudi Arabia, please, sir.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, Saudi Arabia speaking on behalf of the Arab Group. First of all, we'd like to thank all the presenters. My question on the IPCC presentation. We understand that this is only the first part of the IPCC AR6, And of course, there will be the second and the third part that we, as mentioned by you, Madam Chair, Madam Co-Facilitator, that we will be having the chance next year to discuss the outcome of the other two groups. My question, as there are tremendous evidence unequivocally demonstrating the strong sensitivity of climate simulations to assumptions, therefore the expected impacts on climate are also dependent upon the parameterizations implemented in climate models. So my question is, would the expected impacts you have presented still be valid under different parameterizations? And if so, how? And my second question is, how much does it cost to limit the temperature increase to 1.5? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Saudi Arabia. Let's take those questions then. We have a series of questions to the Ipcc, from sea level rise to surface temperature rise and global warming, and the question there from Saudi Arabia. So over to you, Valerie and colleagues.
Okay, so I'll start first with the aspect related to sea level. In the presentation, I've focused on global average sea level, and what matters for coastal risk and responses is local relative sea level. So today we already see that regional sea level change has increased the frequency and severity of extreme sea level events occurring with high tides and storm surges. A near doubling in the frequency of high tide coastal flooding events since the 1960s in many coastal sites. We've also already seen an increase in compound flooding that results from storm surges and extreme rainfall in some locations. The report shows that in the future, about 2/3 of the global coastline will have a projected regional relative sea level rise within about 20% of the global mean increase. And in addition to our interactive atlas, the regional sea level projections from this report are available via the NASA sea level projection tool, so that the information is available. You can dive in and generate local figures corresponding to the global figures presented in the report. And something we have not yet, I think, completely mentioned is the fact that extreme sea level events that occurred rarely in the past, typically once per century, will occur much more frequently. By 2050, it's about 20 to 30 times more frequently. If we look at by 2100, the increase in occurrence is much higher, depends on the level of global warming. And if warming stays below 2 degrees, it would be annually at 60% of coastal locations where tide gauges are available. And for higher levels of warming, it could be up to 80% of the locations that events which in the past occurred once per century would occur annually or more. With a strong increase in the probability of compound flooding due to the combined effects of sea level rise and increased heavy precipitation. We also show how much sea level rise contributes to increases in not just coastal flooding, but also coastal erosion alongst most sandy coasts. So I just wanted to reflect this as
Valerie,
one
can I
aspect.
ask a point of clarification? So when you extreme sea level events, what does that include? What is an extreme sea level event?
It's an event that in the past occurred only once in a century when you had a high tide and an extreme storm surge.
So like a storm surge?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so just with a gradual increase in sea level, events that were very rare in the past, just because of sea level rise, will occur much more frequently. So we provide clear information in the report on that. Another thing which is novel, and maybe Helene could develop, is also the projection of sea level rise for specific levels of peak warming over very long time scales. So it remains associated with limited confidence, but we provide the current state of knowledge over time scales of 2,000 years and 10,000 years with different levels of peak warming, if you would like to present what we have on these very long time scales as well. So there was a question from EU on surface temperature. So we provide in our report the assessment of the updated observational data sets, including surface air temperature over land and sea surface temperature. We include improved methodologies. We include more years compared to the previous report. We also account for possible differences between global surface air temperature and global mean surface temperature. In our report, it leads to a slightly upward revised range for the reported level of surface temperature change to date. When we report the changes to date, we report them for the last decade and also for the last 20 years in our summary for policymakers. When reporting future global temperature changes, we use the term global warming levels. It means averaged over 20 years and compared to the same reference period as in the past, 1850 to 1900. Regarding the question from Saudi Arabia, I would like to flag that in the Working Group 1 report, we rely on all available lines of evidence. We combine the results of all available climate model results, which allows to report robust findings, which are independent, in fact, of the choice of an individual climate model and results that are established robustly, not only based on the use of climate models, but also based on theoretical understanding. For instance, the fact that extreme precipitation increases by around 7% in terms of intensity per degree of global warming is strongly grounded in our understanding of the ability of the atmosphere to hold more moisture with more warming, and that's really theoretical physics that is also supporting this type of finding. I would like to see which authors would like to provide more details. Maybe Juni on the robustness of climate model results.
Yeah, please, Junli.
Yes, so I'd like to respond to the EU regarding the difference between the assessed global surface temperature change and also the global warming level approach. So this is the important advance in this new report. Then we provide the comprehensive assessment for future changes in global surface temperature, ocean warming, and sea level, not only based on scenario-based projection, but also including the other evidence, especially using the updated climate sensitivity, mainly from the Chapter 7. Then the approach on global warming levels allows for a fully constant assessment of changes in different climate variables, bridging the gap between the assessed global surface temperature change and climate response pattern to global warming. So those are not the different approach, but rather comprehensive approach. So using this assessed global surface temperature, we provide when the global warming level crossing. Then for the physical climatic impact, we use this global warming level approach.
Thank you. Did anybody else want to? Yuri? No, you're okay?
I think Helene would like to.
Yeah, please, Helene.
So just to follow up again on the question from Fiji, in terms of the low likelihood, high impact outcomes of sea level, the report is clear with SSP 2, 4.5, 1, 2.6, or 1, 1.9. The low likelihood, high impact events associated with significant ice loss around Antarctica are much less likely. So we really reduce the risk of those high values of high magnitudes of sea level rise. If we look on longer time scale, so I think the question in one sense could be turned around, and you see this in the report. We also talk about the uncertainty in the timing of reaching certain levels of sea level rise. So, you know, it's not will we reach 1 metre, but when we will reach 1 metre. So, of course, if we limit sea level, if we limit temperatures, it's going to be much later when we reach 1 metre. So that will give a much longer timescale for adaptation. And there's lots of indications from paleo reconstructions that you know, this sea level will be attained on longer timescales. So even if we stabilise at 1.5 degrees in several thousand years, we will still have global mean sea level of 2 to 3 metres. But if we stabilise at higher levels, we're looking at much higher numbers, even at 2 degrees, going up to about 6 metres.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. Yuri.
I will respond to the EU's question on how we go from temperatures to emissions and then from emissions to temperatures in the UNEP emissions gap report. For temperatures to emissions, we basically take emission pathways from the literature and we use climate emulators that were actually calibrated within the Ipcc AR6 Working Group 1 process to integrate all the insight and the full assessment of the uncertainties of the climate response in a single tool. These tools have also been used throughout the Working Group 1 report to make climate projections. So we use those to assess the temperature outcome of a given emission pathway, and then we group pathway based on whether they limit warming to 1.5 or 2, and thus taking into account the uncertainties as assessed in Working Group 1. To then go from the emissions to the temperatures, NDCs are often given for 2030. If we want to estimate emissions until the end of the century, we need to extrapolate those. In the UNEP emissions gap report, we make a set of assumptions and we vary them to see what the variation is of that. For example, in the UNEP gap report, we highlight that, and I need to take the numbers here not to be mistaken, that there is a roughly ½ degree uncertainty on the temperature projections linked to the NDCs. So where they would be limiting warming with a 66% chance below 2.7 degrees, there is actually half a degree in uncertainty on that number based on assumptions that are unknowable at this stage in time.
Thank you. Yeah, Valerie, did you want to add something?
Yes, there was also a question about costs of emission reductions, and this is not part of the Working Group 1 assessment. And as I have flagged, in terms of understanding a 1.5 degree warmer world and other warmer worlds, having very low emission scenarios is an advance in that this was not available at the time of the SR15 report. So in terms of purely global climate modeling and understanding the implications, this is just what is reflected in our report.
Okay. Again, something we might learn more about in future reports. Maybe.
I cannot preclude the other reports, but I would like to flag that there will be much more regarding impacts and adaptation in the Working Group 2 report, and regarding the possibility to reduce emissions in the Working Group 3 report.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you. And there were some questions in there for Unit 2. Did you want to pick up on the emissions gap translated into temperature? Some more, or just, were you happy with Yuri?
I think Yuri already answered that, didn't you? But if more explanation is needed...
Okay, if more is needed, we can come back to you.
Yes.
And have you considered the costs of net zero and achieving it as a proxy, if you like, for 1.5?
I think it's an area where new and more studies are needed.
Yeah.
The cost of
So
of limiting warming to different levels, and also on the adaptation cost side, the estimates that we have, the really robust, good estimates, are fairly old by now, and it's actually something that we've been discussing, especially in the context of the Adaptation Gap report, to ask for resources to conduct a really good analysis of the cost of adaptation and how they have changed since the 2010 report that came out.
Is that something that you looked at in Standing Committee on Finance, or is that more looking at what has been done? Have you costed future scenarios?
For the biennial assessment, it's more an ex post analysis of what's done, but there is some alignment to the needs of developing countries where the flows are going to. There is another mandated report from the Standing Committee on Finance called the First Report on the Determination of the Needs of Developing Countries. That is, the first edition of that has just been done this year. So that goes into more about what data is out there on overall needs, both from national level reports, submissions to the UNFCCC, as well as global or regional reports such as the UNEP Adaptation Gap report.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Great, that's all really helpful. Let's take a couple more questions. So Brazil, you had a question, and then I'll come to the United States. If anyone else wants to add their name to the list, wave. Antigua Barbuda, I see you, and Norway, I already have you on my list. You're coming up shortly. And India, sir, I still have you on my list as well. Brazil.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Facilitator, and thank you very much for providing the guiding questions put in front of us. I would like to refer to theme 1, question 1, on what new knowledge has, in particular, the Ipcc gathered regarding the scenarios towards achieving the long-term global goal. Both Ipcc and UNEP have presented information on different greenhouse gases pathways and scenarios, and the Brazilian delegation would appreciate if the Ipcc could elaborate on the importance of the choice of the emissions metrics used to calculate aggregated emissions and removals of different greenhouse gases in the light of the long-term global goal. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brazil. Can I invite the United States to ask their question?
Thank you very much, and thank you again to the authors for their very informative presentations. So my first question is for the Ipcc. The Working Group 1 report presented many concerning and unambiguous findings about how human activities are driving changes in the Earth system. But there were also some findings that inform actions about what can be done. Can you talk more about the most significant findings that parties should look to build upon to increase ambition and to continue to make progress towards the long-term global goal? And my second question is for both UNEP and the Ipcc. We appreciate efforts to highlight the positive messages and opportunities that parties can consider. Many countries have joined or are currently considering joining the Global Methane Pledge, which has a collective goal of reducing global methane emissions by at least 30% from 2020 levels to by 2030. Can you talk more about how countries can better understand and assess opportunities to reduce methane emissions, and how do methane reductions of this nature contribute towards pathways to 1.5 degrees? Thank you.
Thank you for those hopeful solutions-oriented questions. I think we need a few of those at the moment, so those are very welcome. Norway, please. Did you want to ask your question? Very welcome.
Thank you, and I think this is very useful. I think also, as have been said, the Ipcc reports are very important for our deliberations in this process, and I hope also that we can come back to Ipcc more in detail tomorrow and so on. But my questions is, first I have a question related to Ipcc. It's about, we have discussed the sea level rise, and Ipcc also presented the global temperature increase as some sort of indicator. And it seems that it is some differences in time scales. Maybe the sea level rise, it's going more slowly than other changes. So that is one question. For instance, when we compare to storm surge, extreme sea level rise, we are already experiencing that now, and so maybe you can expand a little bit on, you know, the difference in time scales, maybe on a more near-term time scale, that we will have this response earlier and so on. And then I have one question to UNEP and the GAP report. I think it was very useful what was said about, you know, the countries that have targets and goals about net zero emissions. And you also said that it was some differences and maybe in some cases not so clear how to fulfill them. Maybe you can expand a little bit more about what is, how clear these targets are and to what extent they can be, you know, built into this kind of structural changes that are needed for such a development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Norway. Okay, we took 3 there, so let's get some answers and then we'll come back for another round. So IPCC colleagues, I will go to you first. I won't repeat all the questions because I think you have them. They were very clear. So Valerie, over to you.
Thank you. So I would like to turn, I think, to Piers regarding the question on the metrics. Piers, would you like to address this one?
Yes, I'm quite happy to address that one. So the kind of temperature pathway for any given multi-gas emission scenario does not depend on the emission metric at all. But so what does depend on it is the kind of timing of net zero greenhouse gases for aggregated basket of gases.
Thank you. I think that regarding the question about what can be done, Yuri, you may want to take the floor.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So the question was, what are the most significant findings? I think the finding that global net zero CO2 emissions need to be achieved to stabilize global warming is a key one. That also the total carbon budget that will be emitted until that time will determine the maximum amount of warming that we will see. The quantifications in the Working Group 1 report show that there is a very limited carbon budget remaining for limiting warming to the temperature levels that are relevant to the Paris Agreement. And finally, linking it also to your question on methane, these quantifications of the remaining carbon budget already assume deep reductions in methane. That means that if deep reductions in methane are not achieved globally, then the remaining carbon budget for a certain temperature level would be even smaller. And for example, in the table SPM2 of the summary for policymakers, one can see that depending on how successful or unsuccessful one is in reducing methane emissions, the remaining carbon budgets can vary by plus minus 220 gigatons of CO2.
Okay, yeah. Could I ask, building on that, so in terms of what can be done, is there more that can be said on the opportunities that lie within? Clearly we understand how difficult it is. Is it possible to give some examples of the kind of opportunities too.
Yeah, Pierce.
Thanks, Piers.
Yeah, just as kind of Valerie kind of said in an earlier answer, that there are some really good short-term opportunities that come with rapid and sustained emission reduction, particularly for gases like methane, but they're also there as well with early action on things like kind of coal burning, where you also remove sulfur dioxide, which is an important air quality pollutant, and we did look over all at the effect of near-term mitigation on the 20-year temperature trends, and we did find from that work that you can have a substantial difference with those 20-year temperature trends, depending which pathway you take within the next 10 years.
Thank you. Valerie, did you want to say a final word?
I think Helen would like to address the question about the time scales of responses, from what directly scales to global warming to the slower components of the climate.
Yeah, so with sea level, we're already seeing committed changes to past emissions. Norway's right that temperature and sea level are not linearly related on the long term. That's because there's the ocean warming, the deep ocean warming, and the ice sheets respond on much longer millennial timescales. So we talk in the report about peak warming. So when temperature peaks at, say, 1.5 degrees, it will take thousands of years for sea level to equilibrate to those levels. We're already seeing changes of sea level. So previously this century, sea level was dominated by thermal expansion. Now the ice sheet loss is accelerating. So that's why we've seen an acceleration in sea level rise. We're already seeing an increase in extremes. So extremes that were occurring 5 times per year are now occurring 8 times per year. And Valerie talked about how that will increase more in the future as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Helen. Valerie, you were just going to pick up on another point, and we're very happy to welcome back Professor Gao. We're still talking, we're still here, so great to have you back.
I wanted to flag that while the focus here is on the global characteristics, our report also reflects advances regarding city-scale climate change and the interplay between the type of urbanization and the local implications. So, as we know, cities can intensify human-induced warming locally, and it can also intensify runoff. And when you have more intense rainfall events or more severe hot extremes, it may either go towards increasing the characteristics, or by the choices in terms of types of urbanization, it can also contribute to partly limit the climate change characteristics. This is also something that is reflected in the report based on advances in urban climate science. I wanted to flag that aspect, which is also very important for local implications.
Thank you. No, and that's a great example I think we can all relate to. Anne, I was going to come back to you for additional thoughts on the question from the United States on methane.
Yes, thank you. So there's one chapter in the emissions gap report that actually focuses on the possibility and scope for reducing emissions from methane. And if we look at at 2030, the report finds that it would actually be possible to reduce methane emissions by between 30 to 50% by 2030 alone. And if we look at anthropogenic methane emissions, the three big areas are agriculture, it's fossil fuels, and it's waste. And there are several opportunities to reduce emissions in these areas. For instance, for fossil fuels, with existing technologies, you can reduce methane leaking from oil, gas, and coal facilities. In agriculture, it can be changing in, for instance, rice growing patterns. A lot of the methane emissions are from rice cultivation. It can be breeds of cattle and also diets of cattle that can reduce methane emissions. And then on waste, for instance, landfills, diverting organic materials from landfills or capturing landfill gas can reduce methane emissions. And in this forum, of course, it's worth highlighting that there are several opportunities for countries to actually reduce or to include methane reductions in their nationally determined contributions and to include specific targets for methane reductions. One of the lead authors of the report found that of the 46 countries that contribute 90% of agricultural emissions, methane emissions, only a quarter have included measures targeting emissions from livestock in their NDCs so far. So there are opportunities. Thank you.
Okay, another opportunity highlighted. I have India and Antigua and Barbuda to come on my list. Just two things. One was to invite any observers in the room who wanted to ask a question to let me know. Wave your hand and you will be more than welcome to take the floor. One last reminder to those following us online that you can use the raised hand function to ask your question if you wish to do so. India, sir, and then Antigua and Barbuda. Oh, India, ma'am. You're very welcome.
Happy to be back here. Thank you.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too, Madam Co-Facilitator. The advantage of going last is that now we get to speak as a dialogue and not just a structured expert Q&A. And I understand the challenge of being an expert is that sometimes you have to speak beyond your comfort level. This is going to be an observation on what has been said by our experts here today. Nobody is answering the question of how did we get here? So while Talanoa is a great reference point on the questions that should be answered, it is not exactly the best reference point on the kind of questions we need answered. We're talking about existing commitments under the convention, but we keep speaking of future neutrality as a scenario to achieve the long-term global goal. That is not the mandate of this agenda item. Also, respectfully, the UNEP is saying that it does not reflect on equity and fairness in its assessment. Now, firstly, equity is not a benchmark of fairness, but of ambition itself. And secondly, if fairness is not a consideration, then how is carbon budget even being deliberated? Because carbon budget talks about fair share, and I don't think it's in dispute that fair share means that countries must not exceed their fair share of carbon budget, and they should not encroach on the others' fair share of carbon. Madam Co-Facilitator, again, respectfully, let us not jettison discussions on pre-2020 by saying that it's been discussed in the previous sessions. There are issues that we still need to discuss. There are promises that we still need to be fulfilled. For example, on the developed side taking lead, on the provision of finance, on technology transfer and development, and on capacity building. Just taking cue from that, the reports that we are discussing here, they are reflective of the science that we are saying is the new knowledge since the last review that happened in 2013 and 15. But how much of that report or the summary of policymakers actually understood by the policymakers? So we cannot just talk numbers and figures and projections, because they, at beyond a point of time, they start looking as conjectures. There are certain parameters that need to be assessed, and therefore equally theme 1 and theme 2 need to be answered, because we are not seeing the assessment of efforts by the parties answered as much as possibly the narrative that the science is currently establishing, which is not an accurate narrative. I wouldn't go ahead and say it's a false narrative, but it's not the accurate narrative that is being established. So some of the experts are returning experts. They have already interacted with the parties here, and our concerns have been placed before them. This discussion is going to continue tomorrow. These are concerns that we are raising as a party, and we would like that these concerns be taken into consideration and certain pertinent questions be answered as per the mandate of the agenda item. And if we are going to answer where we are in this discussion with the experts, then there are certain questions that possibly tomorrow, when theme 2 is taken up, then India would like the opportunity to raise those pertinent questions as the presentations take forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And maybe just India, from me, just to clarify that, yeah, we have been considering theme 1 and theme 2 here today and again tomorrow. So any questions, comments are very welcome on theme 2. Just to be clear also, in case I wasn't, we haven't jettisoned the pre-2020 report. I reminded you that we spoke about it the last time and that it remains on the table as a source of information to be brought into the structured expert dialogue. And I think that's really important for everybody to remember. Everything that we've discussed in the structured expert dialogue for this second periodic review remains on the table. All of those presentations, all of the inputs, they're all part of our consideration up until we finish this process. So nothing is dealt with and gone at all. So we'll come back to some of the questions in a moment, but can I hear from Antigua and Barbuda first? Thank you.
Thank you once again for allowing me to take the floor. This question is directed to UNEP. So we'd like to thank the authors for the critical important assessment made in the emission gaps report. We are particularly intrigued by your analysis of 2030 commitments and net zero targets. The graph you showed indicate a linear path towards net zero. We would like to see guidance on how such linear reduction paths compare to domestic emission reduction pathways for big emitters documented in scientific literature. Are there differences in warming outcome between such a linear path and one that shows accelerated near-term action? And what does the best available science say about alignment of 2030 commitments and long-term targets, noting that this is a commitment the G20 countries have just made? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antigua and Barbuda. Last chance, Helene, if anyone has a question, you need to wave wildly at me. No? Oh, yes. You're very welcome. Come and please come up to one of the standing mics and ask your question. And maybe tell us who you are. Thank you. You're very welcome.
Hello. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
Peter Sims on behalf of the Green European Foundation. Some of the points just raised around equity and fairness, I wondered if there was any details in any of the reports presented around what the breakdown of cumulative emissions historically was, as well as the amount in the future and the predictions and the scenarios about what the breakdown historically was. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Okay, so how about we deal with the specific question to you, Anne, in UNEP first.
Thank you.
From Antigua and Barbuda.
I was also aware that we actually didn't respond to the question from Norway, and maybe I can rope that into the net zero stuff. So you were talking about how I mentioned that the clarity of the net zero emission targets or transparency was sometimes low, and that's reflected in various ways. So, for instance, some are not clear whether they cover all gases or only CO2 or other gases. The same for sectors. Whether they cover international aviation and shipping emissions, whether they exclude offsets, And then more on the commitment side, it's important to see whether there's already a published plan for achieving the net zero emissions target, whether there's a review process established, and also reporting on progress, and sometimes intermediate milestones. So obviously a lot of these net zero emission pledges are very new, and countries are finding their feet, so to speak, in order to find out the best way in taking national circumstances into account on how to achieve them. So I think it's very natural that we don't see very firm plans and very firm milestones yet. What the emissions gap report would like to highlight is that it's quite important to get those milestones established and get them aligned with the long-term targets very soon, because 2050 is not that far away if we want to achieve globally net zero emissions. And that really brings me to the question or comment from India regarding equity and fairness. What we look at is the carbon budget, or the remaining carbon budget at the global level. We're not assigning carbon budgets or looking at carbon budgets spent by individual countries in any way. So that's just to make that clear. And then on the 2030 commitments and the reduction or the emissions paths, of course the linear are a huge simplification, and you can imagine all kinds of pathways. In the report we look at linear, or what we call accelerated or delayed pathways. And I will actually hand over to Yuri because he did some very nice assessments of the implications of whether we choose one or the other in terms of temperature implications as well. But just to say on whether the alignment between the 2030 and the 2050, when we look at the G20 and whether collectively they're on track to achieve their 2030 commitments that are not aligned globally with net zero later in the century, we can see that we don't yet see that alignment globally. Over to you, Yuri.
Thank you, Anne. Yuri.
Yeah, thank you. I can add to this that in the UNEP emissions gap report, we assess the path of a country's emissions towards net zero only for those countries that have chosen to set a net zero target. And in that context, it makes sense that if a net zero target is set for a time relatively, in the relative near future, well, a couple of decades, 2030, that as long as emissions are not declining, one is not necessarily on a path towards achieving that net zero target. So the consequences of not being on a direct path towards net zero is that a path that lies above that is that the cumulative emissions until net zero will be higher, and thus the carbon budget used by that country will be higher, and thus the temperature outcome will be higher, but also that the transition challenges and thus the likelihood that this path will actually materialize over time will be lower. Globally, the variation between a path that reaches net zero CO2 emissions in 2050 and that does so either by still going up until 2030 and then steeply declining, or accelerating until 2030, is around 0.1 degrees in global warming.
Thank you. Valerie, did you want to pick up on the other questions then directed to the Ipcc?
Regarding the role of historical emissions, in the Working Group 1 report, we only look at that aggregated, mostly at the global scale for well-mixed greenhouse gases. We have a more regional focus regarding emissions of short-lived climate forces, those that remain concentrated where they are emitted. And we provide, at the level of the summary for policymakers, the estimate of the contributions of historical emissions to warming to date by gas like CO2, methane, and the masking effects from cooling aerosols. And when reporting warming in the future, we also illustrate the total warming, including the historical one and then the one added by emissions to come after, after the recent past, the start of the assessment. I also wanted to flag that I think in chapter 9, Helene, I think for the first time there's also an estimate of the committed ocean heat increase and associated sea level implications from historical emissions as a novel element of the assessment of longer term implications of past emissions. I think that's what I wanted to share.
Okay, great. There's one more question from an observer that we might just take now. Did somebody have their hand up? No? Oh, over here. Yeah, that's a colleague from an observer. It was an observer organization, no? India again. Hang on 1 second then, just because we have only a couple of minutes left. Can you make your point really, really quickly? Because then Professor
Very
Gao,
quickly.
Yeah.
We would like to state for the record that we do not find the explanation of the linear reduction and the comparison of accelerated and decelerated tenable, because what it does is to establish these possibilities and pass judgment on them, completely ignoring historical cumulative emissions and parties' contributions to it. Only in that perspective would you consider various parties which have had considerable historical responsibility, you would consider their current trajectories as adequate, and those indeed who do not have that kind of historical contribution, but now are, as developing countries, have development deficits to take care. And you characterize them as decelerating. So that what would I say? Decelerating. That's the language used. So we do not accept this explanation. I think it is founded, and as we have already pointed out, on the rejection of all historical responsibility. This is not a moral responsibility. This is simply a question of the exhaustion of the global carbon budget, and that some parties constituting less than a quarter of humanity have occupied almost 3/4 of it. So we can come back to this in other discussions.
Yeah, thank you. And again, I think as Valerie clarified, historical emissions have been fully reflected within the work of Working Group 1, but at the global aggregate level. I wanted to say one thing. Yes, the other Indian delegate, you mentioned the fact that you felt that we perhaps as policymakers and negotiators don't yet understand enough about what's in the science reports. And I guess I just wanted to reflect that that's exactly what this structured expert dialogue is. It's one of the few and rare opportunities that negotiators and policymakers have within the UNFCCC to interact directly with the scientists, the experts, the authors from the Ipcc, and to ask questions. I'm sure we could always do with more time for that. It is incredibly complex. There are layers and layers to the science that we have to consider and try and assimilate in order to shape the right kind of policies. So this is certainly a really good opportunity for us all to do that learning. And I think thank you for coming and engaging and asking your questions, because that helps us all to learn from each other in this process. I'm going to hand over to Professor Gao for a little reflection, and then we'll just close out the session and let you know what's coming tomorrow.
Thank you, Tara, and thank you, colleagues. I am so sad that I think I missed 1 billion tons of wisdom. And I think I totally agree with Tara, and this is a very good opportunity for policymakers to have the dialogue directly to the experts. And this ACD is not a lecture given by experts, but in fact the dialogue. That means the dialogue between policymakers. That means the parties. You are here, and you raise questions. You tell the experts what you want to see and what you need to understand. Then the experts will do their best to answer these questions. And I think the purpose is to not to reach agreement, because this is not negotiation, but to enhance the mutual understanding. And the ultimate purpose is to have this mutual understanding, understand the science, and understand what policymakers want to understand, and then to facilitate our action. And I think this is the purpose for the SCD. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So from Professor Gao and from myself, I want to thank all of you for all of your questions and engagement, and our presenters for sitting here for 3 hours and fielding your questions, and for all the preparation they put into the presentations that they gave to us today. In closing, but in the second panel, we'll be joined again by the Ipcc, by the OECD, and the Third World Network, and again addressing both themes 1 and themes 2. Again, a reminder that we have a virtual poster session from 1:15 to 2:45. There are posters in there from the WMO regional climate centers, again for Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean and Southwest Pacific, as well as from the United Nations Economic and Social Commission